He had $20 to his name and a little girl waiting at home. When the arrogant interviewer tore his resume in half, David walked away, his spirit utterly broken. But he didn't know the woman quietly taking notes in the corner was the billionaire CEO, and she was already running after him. The rain in Seattle hadn't stopped for 3 days, and to David Miller it felt like the sky was weeping for him. He stood under the minimal awning of his apartment building, pulling the collar of his faded navy suit jacket tight against the chill. It was the only suit he owned that still fit, though the cuffs were beginning to fray. Upstairs, his 6-year-old daughter Lily was being watched by Mrs. Bing. Higgins, the elderly neighbor who accepted casseroles in lieu of payment. In David's inside pocket rested a bright green, slightly chewed plastic Tyrannosaurus Rex. Lily had slipped it into his pocket that morning. "For luck, Daddy," she had whispered, her breathing still a little shallow from the asthma attack that had kept them both awake until 3 a.m. David pressed his fingers against the plastic ridges of the toy. He needed more than luck. He needed a miracle. It had been exactly 8 months since he lost his job, and 14 months since he lost his wife Sarah to aggressive pancreatic cancer. The medical bills from Swedish Medical Center had devoured their savings, their college fund for Lily, and eventually the equity in their home. Now a bright pink eviction notice was sitting on his kitchen counter, giving him exactly 14 days to produce $3,000. He stepped out into the rain, power-walking toward the bus stop. Today's interview was at Hayes Global Logistics, a titan in the shipping industry. He was overqualified for the senior operations analyst position, having run an entire regional supply chain before Sarah got sick. But the 2-year gap on his resume, dedicated to holding his dying wife's hand and raising an infant alone, was a red flag to the algorithmic hiring software of the modern corporate world. He had only secured this interview because a former colleague had begged a favor. The Hayes Global headquarters was a towering monolith of steel and tinted glass, radiating cold, untouchable wealth. As David walked through the revolving doors, he felt small. The lobby was a symphony of clicking heels, hushed voices, and the smell of expensive espresso. He checked in at the front desk with a receptionist named Jessica, who barely looked up from her dual monitors, and was directed to the 42nd floor. The waiting area was a minimalist expanse of white leather and chrome. To pass the time and calm his racing heart, David picked up a complimentary corporate magazine and a notepad from the glass coffee table. On the wall opposite him, a massive digital display showed the real-time movement of Hayes Global cargo ships across the Atlantic. David's analytical mind, dormant but not dead, immediately recognized the European cluster. He stared at the ships bottlenecking near the port of Rotterdam. It was a routing nightmare. Without thinking, he grabbed a pen and began sketching a mathematical bypass on the notepad, a hub-and-spoke diversion model he had developed years ago, but never patented. It was a distraction, a way to keep the crushing anxiety at bay. David Miller. David snapped to attention, dropping the pen. He grabbed his worn leather portfolio, inadvertently scooping up the notepad with his sketches, and followed a young assistant into a massive boardroom. Sitting at the head of the sprawling mahogany table was Gregory Pierce, Vice President of Operations. Pierce was the kind of man who wore a $5,000 Rolex and made sure you noticed it. He was aggressively tan, his hair slicked back, exuding an aura of predatory corporate ambition. Sitting much further down the table, almost fading into the background, was a woman in a simple, understated charcoal turtleneck and slacks. She had sharp, observant eyes, her dark hair pulled back into a severe clasp. She didn't introduce herself. Pierce merely waved a dismissive hand in her direction and said, "This is Victoria. She's shadowing our talent acquisition today. Don't mind her." David took his seat. The interview was a disaster from the first minute. Pierce didn't ask about David's previous successes. He didn't ask about his management style. He zeroed in immediately on the bleeding wound of David's resume. 2 years, Mr. Miller, Pierce said, tossing David's resume onto the table as if it were contaminated. A complete blackout for 24 months. In the logistics sector, a 2-year gap means you are functionally obsolete. The technology has evolved, the software has evolved. We use predictive AI now, not spreadsheets. I am a quick study, Mr. Pierce, David said, keeping his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Before my absence, I oversaw a supply chain that increased efficiency by 18%. The fundamentals of logistics, the fundamentals don't concern me, Pierce interrupted, leaning forward. Bandwidth concerns me. Agility concerns me. I see you left your last position for family reasons. Let's be brutally honest. It is a high-performance environment. We manage billions of dollars of cargo. We are a family of sharks. I don't have the luxury of hiring a charity case who might need to leave at 3 p.m. because he can't manage his personal life. The words felt like physical blows. David thought of Sarah's frail hand. He thought of Lily coughing in the middle of the night. My wife passed away, Mr. Pierce, David said quietly. I took time off to care for her in her final months and to stabilize my daughter's life. I am now fully prepared to dedicate myself to my career. Pierce sighed, a dramatic, performative exhalation of breath. He looked down at the table, then up at David with a cold, dead stare. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Miller. Truly. But Hayes Global is not a grief counseling center. We need people who are hungry, not broken. To emphasize his point, Pierce picked up David's resume. With a sickeningly crisp sound, he tore it in half, placing the 2 pieces gently in the wastebasket beside him. We won't be moving forward. Thank you for your time. You know the way out. Silence fell over the room. At the end of the table, the woman named Victoria stopped writing on her tablet. David felt the blood roaring in his ears. The urge to yell, to flip the table, to grab Pierce by his expensive silk tie was overwhelming. But then he felt the weight of the plastic dinosaur in his pocket. He was a father. He had to maintain his dignity. Without a word, David stood up. He buttoned his frayed suit jacket. He looked Pierce dead in the eye, nodded once, and turned around. In his haste and humiliation, he fumbled his portfolio. The notepad he had been sketching on slipped out, along with the bright green plastic T-Rex clattering onto the thick Persian rug. David didn't even notice. He just wanted to escape. He walked out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him, sealing his failure. He was ruined. The eviction was certain. He had failed his wife. He had failed his daughter. Inside the ballroom, the silence lingered for exactly 3 seconds after the door clicked shut. Gregory Pierce leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together and stretching his arms. He let out a self-satisfied chuckle. Unbelievable, Pierce muttered, turning toward the quiet woman at the end of the table. Can you believe HR let that guy through the initial screening? The guy looked like he was about to cry. We need killers on this floor, Victoria. Killers. Victoria Hayes did not smile. At 38, Victoria was the sole owner and CEO of Hayes Global, a company she had inherited on the brink of bankruptcy 10 years ago and ruthlessly rebuilt into a $40 billion empire. She was notoriously private, rarely giving interviews and almost never visiting the regional branch offices. She had flown into Seattle unannounced, posing as an internal compliance auditor, because the West Coast division was bleeding money and she wanted to know why. For the past 3 days, she had sat silently in these rooms, watching Gregory Pierce operate. She had seen him hire sycophants. She had seen him bully intelligent women into silence. But what he had just done to David Miller was a masterclass in toxic arrogance. Victoria stood up slowly. She didn't look at Pierce. Instead, she walked over to the spot where David had stood. She bent down and picked up the bright green plastic dinosaur. It felt light and cheap in her palm, a stark contrast to the heavy, oppressive wealth of the room. Then her eyes fell on the notepad David had dropped. She picked it up, expecting to see nervous scribbles or interview notes. Instead, she saw a complex, hand-drawn schematic. Her breath hitched. Victoria was a billionaire because she understood numbers better than anyone alive. She stared at the paper. It was a diversion algorithm. The nodes were labeled with port initials: RTM for Rotterdam, HARM for Hamburg, ANT for Hamburg, ANT for... Beside the schematic were 3 lines of handwritten predictive calculus. It was a brilliant, elegant solution to the exact European shipping bottleneck that was currently costing Hayes Global $40 million a month. The very problem Pierce had blamed on unforeseeable market conditions during yesterday's board meeting. This man, sitting in their lobby for 20 minutes, had solved the crisis their entire analytics department hadn't cracked in 6 months. And Pierce had just thrown him away because of a resume gap. Victoria? Victoria? Pierce asked, his smug tone faltering slightly as he noticed the intense, terrifying stillness of his CEO. Is something wrong? Victoria leapt up from the paper. Her eyes, usually cold and calculating, were ablaze. You told him we need killers, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You told a man who watched his wife die and who raised a child alone through unimaginable grief that he was weak. I was protecting the company's interests. Pierce stammered, suddenly hyper-aware of the shift in the room's power dynamic. You wouldn't know the company's interests if they ran you over with a freight truck, Gregory. Victoria snapped, walking toward him. She slammed the notepad down on the mahogany table right in front of him. Look at this. Look at it. Pierce flinched, leaning over the table. It's just math. I don't see. Of course you don't, Victoria said, her voice dripping with absolute venom. Because you are a middle management parasite who confuses cruelty with leadership. That man out there didn't break under your pathetic attempt to humiliate him. He showed restraint. He showed dignity. And in his spare time in our lobby, he solved the Rotterdam bottleneck. Pierce went pale. Victoria, please, I didn't know. You're fired, Victoria said, the words cutting through the air like a guillotine. You can't be serious, Pierce choked out. My contract, your contract, has a gross incompetence clause, and I just witnessed it firsthand, Victoria said, already turning away from him. Security will be up in 5 minutes to escort you out. Leave the watch. It was a company bonus you no longer deserve. Victoria didn't wait to see his reaction. She grabbed the notepad and clutched the plastic dinosaur tightly in her left hand. She practically kicked the boardroom doors open and sprinted down the hallway. Jessica, Victoria shouted as she approached the reception desk. The receptionist jumped in her seat. Miss Hayes? Yes? The man who just left. David Miller. Did he take the elevator down? He just got in car number 4, Jessica said, her eyes wide. Victoria hit the elevator call buttons, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched the digital numbers of car 4 descending rapidly. 30, 20, 10. The other cars were stuck on the upper floors. Damn it, she cursed under her breath. She couldn't lose him. A man like that, with that kind of quiet resilience and genius, was a 1 in a million find. She had spent a decade surrounding herself with sharks, and it had made her company rich, but it was rotting it from the inside out. She needed someone with a soul. She abandoned the elevator and slammed through the heavy fire doors leading to the emergency stairwell. She was on the 42nd floor. She couldn't run down all of them, but she had to try. She took the concrete stairs 2 at a time, the sound of her expensive heels echoing violently in the hollow shaft. She made it down 5 flights before her lungs started burning. She threw open the door to the 37th floor, frantically hit the elevator button, and by sheer luck, an empty car chimed and opened. She jammed her finger on the lobby button. The descent felt like it took hours. When the doors finally parted at the ground floor, Victoria sprinted across the marble lobby. The security guards at the front desk stepped back in shock as the billionaire CEO of the company rushed past them, her perfectly tailored hair now slightly out of place, a green plastic toy clutched in her fist. She burst through the revolving glass doors and out into the torrential Seattle rain. The gray street was crowded with pedestrians hiding under umbrellas. Taxis were splashing water onto the sidewalks. Victoria scanned the crowd frantically. She didn't know what he looked like from the back. She just remembered the frayed navy suit. There, half a block down, walking with his head bowed against the driving rain, completely unprotected from the downpour. He looked like a man who carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders, entirely unaware that his life was about to change forever. Victoria didn't care about the rain ruining her silk blouse. She didn't care about the stares of the pedestrians. She began to run down the wet pavement, dodging briefcases and umbrellas. "David!" She screamed over the roar of the traffic and the rain. "David Miller! Wait!" David heard his name piercing through the relentless drumming of the Seattle rain. He stopped, his worn leather shoes sinking into a shallow puddle. He didn't turn around immediately. His mind, battered by the morning's humiliation, struggled to process the sound. Was the front desk calling him back? Did he accidentally walk out with one of their expensive corporate pens? He pivoted slowly, running down the sidewalk toward him. Entirely ignoring the torrential downpour ruining her designer clothes was the quiet woman from the boardroom, the one Pierce had dismissed as a shadowing assistant. She came to a halt a few feet away, gasping for breath. Her dark hair, previously pulled back in a severe, perfect clasp, was plastered to her cheeks. Rainwater streamed down her face, but her sharp, observant eyes were locked onto his. "Mr. Miller," she panted, holding up a hand to signal him to wait. David frowned, instinctively tightening his grip on his battered portfolio. "If this is about the interview," he said, his voice drained of all emotion. "Mr. Pierce made the company's position clear, but I don't need an apology from an assistant. I just want to go home to my daughter." Victoria stood up straight, wiping a streak of wet hair from her eyes. She stepped closer, invading the small space under the awning of a closed bakery where David had retreated. "I am not an assistant, David," she said, her voice cutting through the traffic noise with startling authority. "My name is Victoria Hayes. I am the CEO and sole owner of Hayes Global Logistics, and Gregory Pierce no longer works for my company." David stared at her. The words didn't compute. The CEO? The CEO, the billionaire founder who had graced the cover of the Wall Street Journal? He looked at the soaked woman in front of him. The charcoal turtleneck clung to her arms, her expensive leather heels were stained, but the intensity radiating from her was unmistakable. "You fired him?" David asked, shock breaking through his numbness. "Why?" Instead of answering immediately, Victoria uncurled her left fist. Resting on her pale palm was the bright green plastic Tyrannosaurus Rex. "You dropped this," she said softly. David's breath hitched. He reached out with a trembling hand and took the toy. If he had come home and told Lily he lost her lucky dinosaur on top of failing the interview, it would have broken whatever small piece of his heart he had left. "Thank you," he whispered, swallowing hard. "I also found this," Victoria continued, pulling his slightly crumpled rain-spotted notepad from her pocket. She held it up so the hand-drawn schematic of the European ports was visible. "I need you to tell me exactly what this is, because to me, it looks like a predictive diversion algorithm that bypasses the current congestion at the port of Rotterdam." David shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a sketch, rerouting cargo through Antwerp and Hamburg using smaller feeder vessels rather than waiting for megaships to clear deepwater docks. It reduces demurrage charges by roughly 30%. Just a mathematical model I played around with." "Now da so do so what now?" "So you played around with a solution to a logistical nightmare that is currently bleeding my company $40 million a month?" Victoria asked, her tone a mixture of incredulity and deep respect. "My analytics team has given me excuses for 6 months. You sat in my lobby for 20 minutes and drew the answer on scrap paper." David looked down. "It doesn't matter, Miss Hayes. As your former vice president pointed out, my resume has a 2-year gap. I am functionally obsolete. Gregory Pierce was a fool who couldn't see past a piece of paper, Victoria snapped. I built Hayes Global from the ground up. I know the difference between someone who relies on software to do their thinking and someone who understands the heartbeat of a supply chain. You have a gift. She stepped closer, indifferent to the rain pooling around them. I am offering you a job, Director of Global Routing. You will report directly to me, completely bypassing regional management. Your first assignment will be implementing this Rotterdam bypass. David felt the ground tilt. Director of Global Routing. The salary would be in the high six figures. Ms. Hayes, David started, his voice cracking as the desperate reality of his situation crashed over him. I have a 6-year-old daughter with severe asthma. I have an eviction notice that expires in 14 days. I cannot give you 80-hour work weeks. If my daughter needs me, I will walk out of the boardroom, no matter who is speaking. Victoria didn't flinch. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. David, the corporate world told you that caring for your dying wife and raising your child made you weak, Victoria said quietly. They lied. It made you resilient. I have a boardroom full of ruthless sharks and they are driving my company into the ground. I need a man who knows what it means to actually care about something. She placed a hand on his damp shoulder. If Lily is sick, you go home. You can build the Rotterdam algorithm from your kitchen table. For all I care, as long as it gets done. Do we have an understanding? David stared into the eyes of the billionaire CEO. The crushing weight on his chest began to lift. He gripped the green plastic dinosaur in his pocket. We have an understanding, David said. They didn't go back to the towering Hayes Global headquarters. Victoria insisted they get out of the cold immediately. They walked 2 blocks to a dimly lit, unpretentious place called Bell Tower Diner. Sitting in a vinyl booth, shivering slightly in his damp suit, David watched in surreal disbelief as one of the wealthiest women in America ordered 2 black coffees and a stack of napkins. We'll have HR draft the official paperwork on Monday, Victoria said, pulling a sleek silver pen from her purse. But I know what it's like to have a landlord breathing down your neck. When I took over this company, we were hours away from foreclosure. The panic, it rewires your brain. I won't let you sit in that panic for another weekend. She began writing on the diner napkin. She outlined a base salary that made David dizzy, a comprehensive health insurance package that would cover all of Lily's asthma specialists without copays, and the remote flexibility clauses they had discussed. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a personal checkbook. She quickly filled it out and slid it across the table. David looked at the check. It was a signing bonus. $25,000, more than enough to pay off the eviction, clear the most aggressive medical debt, and fill their refrigerator with actual groceries. Victoria, I can't. David stammered, staring at the zeros. It's a standard executive signing bonus, Victoria lied smoothly, taking a sip of her coffee. Consider it an advance on the millions you're going to save me in Europe. Go pay your landlord, David. Go buy your daughter something nice. For the first time since Sarah had passed, the dam broke. David pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, his shoulders shaking as silent, heavy tears of absolute relief spilled over. He didn't care that he was crying in a diner in front of his new boss. The suffocating terror of losing his home, of failing his little girl, was suddenly, miraculously gone. Victoria didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply sat there in comfortable silence, letting him process the monumental shift in his universe, knowing exactly how heavy the burden of survival could be. 2 hours later, David walked up the creaky stairs to his apartment building. He didn't power walk. He didn't rush. He took his time, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet. He knocked gently on Mrs. Higgins' door. The elderly woman opened it, looking concerned. David? You're back early. How did it go? Oh dear, you're soaked. From the living room, a tiny voice yelled, Daddy! Lily ran to the door wearing oversized, mismatched socks and a faded, oversized t-shirt. She threw her arms around his wet legs. David dropped to his knees, not caring about his suit, and pulled her into a fierce, tight embrace. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Did the lucky T-Rex work, Daddy?" Lily asked, pulling back to look at his face. She noticed his red eyes. "Are you sad?" David smiled. A massive, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the green dinosaur, placing it carefully in her small hand. "It worked perfectly, sweetie," David whispered. "It was the luckiest dinosaur in the whole wide world. We're going to be okay. We're going to be really, really okay." The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Hayes Global Logistics looked entirely different. The oppressive, competitive silence was gone, replaced by the hum of collaborative energy. At the head of the table sat Victoria Hayes, looking over a quarterly report. The numbers were staggering. The Rotterdam bypass, now officially known internally as the Miller Protocol, had been implemented flawlessly. It hadn't just saved the projected 40 million, it had streamlined the entire European theater, increasing overall regional profits by 12%. Sitting halfway down the table, presenting a new predictive model on a digital screen, was David. He looked completely transformed. He wore a sharp, well-tailored suit. The dark circles under his eyes had vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a man operating at the peak of his intellect. As he wrapped up his presentation, explaining how a minor adjustment to the Hamburg shipping lanes could cut fuel emissions, Victoria nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, David," Victoria said. "Let's roll out the pilot program next month." David glanced at his watch. It was 2:45 p.m. "I'll have the implementation team draft the timeline," David said, gathering his tablet. "But I'll need to review it tonight. I have to leave now." A newly hired executive across the table blinked in surprise. "Leaving? At 3 p.m. on a Tuesday?" David didn't apologize. He didn't look nervous. He simply smiled. "It's my daughter's elementary school science fair. I promised her I'd be there to help set up her volcano." The new executive looked nervously at the CEO, expecting a reprimand. Instead, Victoria Hayes just waved a hand toward the door. "Tell Lily I said good luck," Victoria smiled. "And David, make sure the volcano actually erupts this time." "It will," David laughed, walking out of the boardroom with his head held high. He stepped into the elevator, feeling the smooth descent. He had walked out of this building 6 months ago as a broken man, stripped of his dignity. Now he was walking out on his own terms, as a leader, a father, and a man who had proven that the greatest strength a person could possess wasn't ruthlessness. It was the fierce, unyielding love for the people they held dear. He walked through the lobby, giving a warm wave to Jessica at the front desk, and pushed through the revolving doors into the bright Seattle afternoon. It wasn't raining today. The sky was a brilliant, clear blue. Sometimes the universe breaks you down right before it builds you back up. If David's story moved you, please hit that like button, share this video to inspire someone fighting their own silent battles, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of resilience, hope, and the unexpected twists that change our lives forever. See you in the next video.